So the way that I got invited is through the ACM Distinguished Speakers Program. And in case you don't know what ACM is, I am proud to be an ACM member. It is the premier global community of computing professionals and students with a whole bunch of members in a whole bunch of countries. And their mission is to help computing professionals be their best and most creative. Creativity is kind of a theme, I think, in this room with so many different ways of thinking. But I've underlined the things that kind of give me a great lead into our talk, because ACM sees a world where computing helps solve tomorrow's problems and where we can use our knowledge to make a positive social impact throughout the world. So let's think about positive social impacts and think about gender and software. So how do these relate? It turns out that a lot of software has what I call gender bias bugs, or sometimes we call these gender inclusiveness bugs. And so now we see this worried software developer, or maybe it's a UXer or a software manager, and they're thinking about their busy workload, and they say, "You're kidding, where are these?" And the answer is everywhere in most of the IT and software that people in the computing professions create. And furthermore, it's in the tools that people who create software use to do it. So this is pretty bad. And here's this worried software developer saying, uh-oh, this sounds like something I'm going to have to spend time on. I'm busy. How much does this really matter? And the answer is a lot. Because when there is software that you're trying to use to solve a problem, and it's not a great fit to your cognitive styles, then there's like this heavy cognitive tax that you have to pay as you work your way through what you came to the software to do. So that's bad. But some of you may be saying, okay, fine, fine, fine. But here's a money reason also to care. So usually the gender that gets excluded by a lot of software happens to be women. And women drive 70 to 80% of consumer purchasing. In fact, according to the Harvard Business Review, women are the largest emerging market, more than double China and India's GDP combined. So the Harvard Business Review calls women the world's largest growth opportunity. So even if we don't care about the inequities, we care about the money. And here's another reason to care too, and that's the quality of software itself. So it turns out the design community knows this, that addressing some segment of the population that's been underserved by a product tends to help everyone. And the classic example of this is curb cuts, those cutout places in the sidewalk. So way back in the olden days, when I was a kid and many of you weren't even born, there were no curb cuts. And somebody noticed somebody like that and said, wow, this is really terrible, that they have to deal with that, and curb cuts were born. And they did help people in wheelchairs, so that's kind of awesome. And they helped people with those walkers with wheels on them too. And they helped mothers pushing their babies in strollers. And they helped people on bicycles. And they helped people pushing heavy bales of hay with those wheeled dollies. And they helped the few people who have suitcases like that. You've seen those with wheels, right? Yeah. So what this shows us is, even though we didn't really realize as a society that there was anything wrong with sidewalks except for people in wheelchairs, by paying attention to the needs of people in wheelchairs, we made them better for everyone. Okay, so hopefully those three reasons and more have everybody inspired, okay, we've got to do something about software to make sure that it's inclusive and gender inclusive. But before I tell you what to do, I want to tell you what not to do. Shrink it and pink it. Some of you have probably heard of this. If you haven't, you'll find it on Google. Dell's pink laptops is a classic example of shrink it and pink it. So back in 2009, Dell decided they'd like to get some more money from women, so they painted their laptops pink, and maybe they shrank them a little bit too, that I don't know. And they put together a website too with recipes. Guess how long that website lasted? Just guess. A day? Guess smaller. Any smaller guesses? 2 hours? Guess smaller. Guess smaller. 20 minutes. The outcry was so great that they took that website down in 20 minutes. And furthermore, this was before the days of Twitter. So all of that outcry was happening without Twitter to magnify it. Then there's BIC for her. So BIC decided that they'd like some money from women. And so, they got some ink pens and painted them pink and purple and added little sparklies and a label for her. And they raised the price. So you all know Ellen, the talk show host? Oh, my feeble hand, she writes. Before BIC for her, I couldn't do my own writing, my own recipes. I had to ask my husband. But now, thanks to BIC for her. Okay, so these things are bad ideas. And one of the things that makes them, one of the many things that makes them bad ideas, is that the world just doesn't divide into typical people. And so there aren't any typical women, and there aren't any typical men, and there are more than two genders for that matter. And furthermore, people change situationally. So what we can't do is solve a problem like lack of gender inclusivity by dividing the world into piles of people. It can't be about dividing. It's got to be about debugging, about taking down bias bugs one at a time. So how do you do that? Enter the GenderMag method, which, as I mentioned, both Kyle Rector and Anisha Peters were involved in helping make happen in the earliest days. This, by the way, is a free method, not a product, so I'm not trying to sell you something. GenderMag stands for Gender Inclusiveness Magnifier. It's a software process, so if there's anybody in here, I think I heard somebody from sort of coming over from the software engineering community, you can think of it as a software process. HCI people can understand it as an inspection process for user interfaces. And the scope is when there's a person sitting in front of some computer trying to solve a problem. And in some cases, they brought the problem with them. By this I mean they said, I need to balance my budget, or I need to get an airplane reservation, or I need to debug this software, or I have a problem I want to solve, and they're using some kind of software to help do it. But in other cases, they didn't bring a problem. They just sat down thinking they were going to do something straightforward, but the system was so obtuse that they ended up having to problem solve to get there. In any case, it's this setting when the user is somehow trying to solve a problem with their head that GenderMag is in scope. It's based on some personas, which I'll introduce you to in a moment, but, and probably most of you in here have heard of what personas are, but in case you haven't, it's a fake person that's representative of some people, some pile of people from your population. And our personas are a little different from most because they are entirely defined by 5 cognitive facets. And the rest of the stuff is completely customizable. Then there's a process, which is a gender-specialized cognitive walkthrough. HCI people may have heard of this term before. It's a very long-standing HCI method for understanding the steps that somebody goes through when they're trying to learn a new system. And so I'll show you how this all fits together right now. So here's how it works. You start by picking one of the personas that we have. So I pick Abby, done, okay? Then you have some software that you're trying to evaluate, and you come up with a use case or a scenario that you'd like to walk through. So here's some software that some of my students built. These were baby students, not big students, and I just want to say that because you're going to see it's not perfect. Anyway, so this was like a Google map for inside a physical bookstore. So it's a way to work your way through this physical bookstore. And so the scenario that the developers of these students chose was find science fiction books. So Abby wants to find science fiction books in this bookstore. And then you walk through the scenario. with the sub-goals and actions that the developers had in mind, like this. So first, we turn to the developer and we say, what were you hoping Abby would want to do first? Some kind of sub-goal. And the developer said, well, we want Abby to want to see a bookstore map. That's what we have in mind. So we say, okay, we'll evaluate that. So all we do then is answer, will Abby have that sub-goal, given what she's seen so far? Yes, no, maybe, and why? Now, GenderMag is an inclusive methodology. So the people in the room that are evaluating this, we're not asking them to argue it out. We're harvesting a union of their opinions. And so some people might say, yes, Abby will have that sub-goal, and here's why. Some people will say, no, I don't think so. And they're referring to aspects of Abby's cognitive styles to figure out whether she will. And some people might say maybe. We just write it all down. And this is the beginning of our inclusivity bug report. Okay? Then what we do is we push that sub-goal into her head. Remember, personas are fake people, so we really have the power to do this. And then we say to the developer, what action were you wanting her to do with her fingers if she had that sub-goal? And what the students said was, we want her to tap browse off. Okay, awesome. They want her to tap browse off in order to see a map. They're students, that's what they need me for, but that's what they had in mind. So we evaluate it. And we say, will Abby do this? Yes, no, maybe, and why? We harvest all the opinions, write them down, and then after we've written it down, we grab her hand and make her push that button, even if she wouldn't before. And we say, given the feedback she sees, will she feel like she's making progress toward her goal? That's it. Those 3 questions we just do over and over and over again until we get the sub-goal completed. Here's one reason why somebody thought that no, she wasn't going to push browse off. That person is referring to her learning style, and Abby's learning style is not tinkering. So they're saying, no, she's not going to do that because she's disinclined to push and poke. It's really important for us to write down these reasons because those are going to lead us to the fixes for the things that we find. Well, now that you have a really quick overview of how it works, let's look at what's kind of behind it. So I've mentioned that we've got these personas, which are representatives of a subset of our users, but our personas are only from the perspective of 5 cognitive facets. And these facets come from a whole lot of research from a lot of different fields, including psychology, education, communications, computer science, gaming, just a whole lot of fields. Anyway, so there are more facets that we could have used, but we wanted a practical method, so we settled on these 5. One of them is the motivations, why a user would be sitting there in front of the chair using the software. I don't mean how motivated, but what their reasons are. Some people are very task-focused. They came to make their airline reservation, to get to their books, whatever. And other people are kind of motivated by the tool. You know, oh, cool, a new toy. And this affects how they reason. Another one is their information processing style, their computer self-efficacy, which is a specific form of self-confidence, their risk averseness with using software or technology, and their technology learning style. So we're going to get to know a couple of these through Abby. So here's Abby. This is our entire persona. Don't try to read it all. It's tiny little print. All I want you to notice so far is it fits on one screen. So for those of you who are familiar with personas, sometimes they kind of go on and on and on for pages, but we wanted this to be something viable even for software developers who don't really want to read a whole lot about people, so it's one screen. And so I've put this fancy animation on there. I'm sure you graphic designers are going to be impressed. Isn't that fun? There's a top half and a bottom half. The top half is entirely customizable. So you set up the top half to be the right demographics, the right education level, the right job title for whatever kind of software you're trying to evaluate. So for the bookstore navigator, maybe one of the things we'd write there is that Abby is a book lover, and she really loves science fiction. The top half can be anything, but the bottom half is fixed. These are the 5 cognitive facets, and the facets are categories, and then each persona has their own values. So Abby's motivations, for example, are that she's very task-focused. A different persona, Tim, is very technology-focused. He likes to play. So they all have these same 5 categories and different values for these categories. So let's just kind of emphasizing that it really doesn't matter what Abby looks like, what her ethnicity is, what her age is, what her job title is, even what her gender is. It doesn't really matter. Okay, facet number 1. Let's talk about risk. This is attitude toward risk with technology. So Abby, this particular persona, rarely has spare time. She's very, very busy, and so she is risk averse about using unfamiliar technologies that might need her to spend extra time on them because she doesn't have extra time. You can think of yourselves in a situation where you have a paper submission deadline coming up fast, okay? You're not going to start playing around with fancy new features. So let's look at some data behind this. Now, all of the facets that we have are backed by at least 5 independent empirical studies, some done by us, some done by other people. And this is not 5 studies, this is only 1, but 5 is too many to show. As you would expect here, the blue ones are the men and the pink ones are the women. There were also some other genders in here, but their values were so tiny I just left them off because it's just, not really changing the picture. So the first thing that I want you to notice is how much overlap there is between these 2 genders. So people within a gender are more different from each other than they are alike. So this is just another way of repeating that we can't divide the world into men and women, and it just doesn't work that way. But the second thing to notice is that the statistical distributions are very different. So when we talk about there being gender differences that relate to some of these things, what we can see is if we were to run statistical tests, that's exactly what we'd be getting, is significant differences. So the job of our Tim persona is to look out for the interests of all of these risk-tolerant people, regardless of what gender they might be. And the job of Abby is to look out for the interests of all of these risk-averse people, and the Pats pick up the middle. Echo, echo, echo. Okay, one more fancy animation here. Vertical line this time. I'm really versatile. So, Holly, I am echoing like crazy. Is it okay? You are too. Two. Have I done something to make these talk to each other too much? What if I move this way over here? Does that help? No? Huh. Okay, I'll just keep going. Okay, so this vertical bar separates the Tim values from the others. Suppose hypothetically that there was software that only supported these people who are risk tolerant with technology. We can see that in that situation, it would support about half the men in this sample and about a quarter of the women. Okay? So what that shows is if we support only the values over here, and in fact, most software does only support the values over here, although it has to do with cognition, it's also statistically biased by gender. And so this is the moment where I usually say it is about gender and it isn't about gender. It's really not about gender. But if we ignore these cognitive styles, we're disproportionately affecting one gender more than others. Okay, so now let's just switch for a moment to some real-world data with GenderMag in use. So this was a field study. Dr. Peters and I did this. This was the first field study of GenderMag. We published this in Chi 16. And so we, what? Oh, yes, we did. We got a Best Paper Honorable Mention off of this one, yeah. Okay, so we had 4 real-world teams. 2 of them worked for a government agency. One was an East Coast technology company. One was a West Coast technology company. All I really want you to notice here is that there were a lot of different mixes of job titles that were involved in evaluating their own software. Some of them had both men and women, some just men. They had a variety of personas. Some used both Abby and Tim, some just used Abby. Different domains, different age of the software, and different kinds of users envisioned. So with all of that mix, they evaluated their own software using GenderMag, and here's what they came up with, this bar graph. So the y-axis is the percentage of features that they evaluated, and the numbers above the bars are the percent in which they found some kind of usability error. So you can see Team GB, 18% of the features they looked at, they found some kind of usability error. Now, 4% out of that 18 was just usability, generic usability problems. The font's too small, the contrast's off, you know, stuff like that. And 14%, the remaining part of it, was biased against one or another gender. Okay, and we define that as being particularly tied to one of the cognitive styles in the personas, therefore disproportionately affecting people who have that style. So you can see there's quite a range of these different results, but here's the bottom line. 1 out of every 4 of the features that they looked at in their own software, which they presumably loved because they built it, they found some kind of potential gender bias in. 1 out of 4. I was blown away. I could not believe that the number was that high. But it's worse. Then I collected some more data. This is 17 real-world teams, also evaluating their own software. I'm just there taking notes. The smallest number there, what's that say? 12%. Okay, still more than 1 out of 10. What's that big bar say? Can you read that? Yeah, you can read that. 100%. Every single feature they looked at, every one, they found some sort of gender bias in. So is that good news or bad? They found it, right. Yeah, it actually was kind of good news because they found it and they found it early. Because for those of you who know cognitive walkthroughs, you already know that anything you can walk through, you can evaluate in this way. So it can just be design sketches. It doesn't have to be a fully implemented system. And of course, the earlier you find stuff, the more viable it is to fix. And in the case of this 100%, what they had was design mock-ups. They'd only put like 2 days worth of work into that. And then they quickly saw this is never going to do, threw it out and started over. So this is big. It's all commercial software. So let's take a look at a whole different world. Let's look at open source. So I'm sure that most of you have heard that open source software is a community infrastructure that also suffers from underrepresentation of women. And in case you haven't heard that, of course we already know that there are disproportionately small numbers of women in computer science, and in open source it's even smaller. It's much, much smaller. And so together with my colleague Anita Sarma, we started looking at whether the tools and the infrastructure themselves that make up the open source community was partially at fault. And the answer was yes. So we looked at technical barriers. We looked at all different kinds of barriers in the tools and the infrastructure that newcomers were reporting, and we compared them with what we found with GenderMag. And we again found these are huge percentages in which there were potential biases. So where are these coming from? Well, we need facet number 2 to understand that. So facet number 2 is information processing style. When people are trying to solve a problem, a lot of times they feel like what they need is more information. And there's more than one way of gathering this. Abby likes to gather information in batches. So she's one of these people who likes to get her head all the way around a problem first and then start working it out. You've probably seen people like this when you give tests in your classes. You know, like you can imagine, oh wait, there's just one relevant thing. They can take that and start working on it right away. That's not Abby, that's Tim, okay? Abby reads the whole thing, sort of develops a plan, and works it out. In both of these cases, there are advantages and disadvantages, so it isn't as though one of them is better than another. Anyway, so to summarize, Abby's information processing style is very batchy. Tim's is teeny little increments with lots of backtracks. So back to our open source slide. It turned out that the resources provided were very counterproductive to the way Abby likes to learn. As one analyst put it, who was analyzing this particular open source community, he said she would get lost down a rabbit hole of information trying to get to all the things she needs to know. So that's what the open source professionals said using GenderMag. We also collected diaries of the real newcomers. And here's what one of the diaries said, exactly the same thing. There's a lack of details. After about 8 minutes, I realized that the issues are never going to give me the details that I need. Okay, so this is a newcomer backing up what the analyst found. When we looked at these newcomer barriers in the various open source tools, the dark blue bars, these are other people's research. The light blue bars are our research. In many cases, we're finding approximately similar results, although there are some differences down there. But of those, we're finding a really high percentage, again, of these gender biases. So now we've looked at some small set of commercial software. We've looked at open source software. Where else have we found these unlevel planing fields? So there are papers on all of these domains, some by me, some by other people. Programming environments, spreadsheets, e-learning environments, robotics, mobile applications, help systems, websites, digital libraries, and more. So now let's look at it from another perspective. Let's look at this longitudinally. So we did a year-long study at Microsoft using a method called action research. Some of you may have run across this before, especially if you're tied to the education community. It may be familiar to you. And so in action research, you're trying to work out a change, make a change happen. And what we wanted to know is, can we land sort of gender inclusive practices in a real world software company, and how? So in this situation, you've got sort of a treatment, but it changes. You know, you make it better all the way along. And the people that are in the company are researchers too and are helping to shape it. So action research starts with an unfreeze stage. The organization needs to realize they have a problem. And we were very lucky. Microsoft realized that they had a problem. So at the time that I approached them, they had a new CEO, Satya Nadella, and he felt the need for a new mission statement. And his mission statement was to empower every person on the planet to achieve more. And he meant this in a very diversity and inclusion way. And so he's talking about software that is supportive of a huge diversity of problem-solving styles. Now, you may think, oh yeah, but that's just a press release. You know, that's not like real. But he did what all good managers do. He then turned to his managers, the people who worked for him, and said, do this, and if you don't, well, your evaluation isn't going to be so good. So they now realize, uh-oh, we have to figure out some way to fix our software so that it's able to support this kind of diversity. How are we going to do that? So naturally, they turned to the people who worked for them and said, you've got to do this, and you're going to be evaluated on it. So it came all the way down. And so one of the lessons that we really learned is that interest in changing software to make it inclusive has to come from the top down, because otherwise people at the bottom level don't really feel like they have time to work on it because they have other things they're trying to get done. But it doesn't work if it's only coming from the top down. It also has to come from the bottom up. Because no matter what the boss is saying, you know, the people who actually do the work have to care. And luckily we had that too. So that was like the perfect storm, enabling things to at least try to go forward. So they did. And one of the lessons we learned, surprise, gender is politically perilous. Who knew? So it can be viewed as, trying to make software gender inclusive can be viewed as controversial, optional, unneeded, unwarranted. But there was one group of teams who said, I don't care what you say. Half of our target market is women for this product, and if I can't make my product work for Abby, I will have failed. And so they knew they had to do it, and they became the first group of teams to try it. And the first thing they did was found gender biases in 27% of their features, and those were the easy features. Then it got worse. But it was very effective for them. They found a lot of things to fix, and they made their software better, and the user experience reports bore out that it was getting better. And so they became real champions of the method, and they started to spread the word, and other teams started using it. I think one of the things that really made it work there is that they had ways to talk about gender without talking about gender. They could say things like, you know, well, what about people who are risk averse? What about people who learn by tinkering instead of by process? What about people who learn by process instead of by tinkering? And by using that kind of vocabulary, they were able to stay out of danger territory in getting people's hackles up. So at the time I was on sabbatical, and I had access to their information because I was inside the walls, but now I'm outside again. And so at the time I learned about more than 12 products that had changed. One person rewrote the compiler error messages by using things he found with the GenderMag method. One person changed a bunch of features in the next version of product D, which is a very large product. The user X reports were showing very positive responses from both novice and experienced customers, so it was right back in curb cut territory. So how do you get from finding those kinds of problems to fixing them? So the facets point to the fixes. So at the beginning when I said it's really important to write down all the reasons when you're finding these things, those are the things that tell you what to do. So back to the browse off thing, the person who found that said, Abby's not going to do that. That's not her learning style. She's disinclined to push and poke just to see what stuff does. So what that says is make the map discoverable even if that's not your learning style. So the facets tell you what to think about. So we started to get systematic about how you get from the facets to the fixes. We wrote a paper about it, which is coming out in CHI this year. And once again, we were able to use Microsoft as a case study, and they let us write about it. So Microsoft has a product called Academic Search. It's like Google Scholar, only it's Microsoft's. And it's been out there for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And you know, they have all kinds of UXers and stuff like that, so they did the best they could with it. And then they used GenderMag on it. So after they did, they fixed what they found using the facets, and then they did a comparison, A versus B. So in the original version, the one before GenderMag, I love this graph. Well, not this part. In the original version, women failed the various tasks that they had to perform in that product over twice as often as the men. After they fixed things they found with GenderMag, the gender gap completely disappeared, and everybody got better. Yay! So we have more stuff we're working on. We have GenderMag coming to college. So if you would like to teach aspects of GenderMag in your classes, we have opportunities for you to do that. We have lots and lots of resources for teaching. It's a great fit to HEI classes, good fit for other kinds of classes too, web design, game design, software engineering. We have resources available to everybody, and it's a community so you can contribute to it if you want to. This is just kind of a sample of some of the stuff that's available on that website. And you may be wondering, well, where has GenderMag been taught so far? So we've only been working on this for about a year. And this is not the most updated list because I didn't capture the screenshot from earlier today. But look who's on here. Oregon State, surprise, well, that's where I'm from. Cornell and Harvard, famous places, yay. Namibia, University of Science and Technology, where Anish is from. University of Iowa, your competition. Where are you? You could be on this list. If you start teaching with it, please let me know, and I'll add you to the list. Here's what else we have to think about when we think about academia. So we too build software. We build it for our universities. We build class registration systems or buy them. We build web pages. We build forms people fill out. And where we build stuff, we probably build in biases. Yes, indeed, we do. So I've been working with Oregon State so far to try to analyze our own software and clean up our own house. So that's been going on for several months now, and they're finding a bunch of stuff and making it better. University of Indiana has started doing it too, and Cornell's using it a little bit. You could too, so there you go. So many opportunities for you to get involved. So in general, when we use GenderMag in our universities, or when we teach GenderMag or some aspect of it in our classes, this is a way of walking the talk. And so if we say we care about diversity and inclusion, and we continue to crank out software that's biased, then we're not really putting our money where our mouth is. What I'd like everybody in the world to do is to consider gender biases in software to be a debugging problem, not a dividing problem, and to teach students how to get these bugs, how to find these bugs, and how to get them out, which moves promoting diversity into their day jobs. Because if it's part of what they do in developing software, it's like, okay, this is part of software development, not an extra optional thing that I'm supposed to think about, when I take a course. So I propose that it's time for us to walk the talk. So I'd like everybody to use it in practice, use it on the software and the websites that you have control over, if there are any, or you can teach it, train it, or in open source, you can help us with our kind of broken GenderMag tool, which definitely needs help. Or in research, you can apply it, extend it, blend it, study it, and automate it, leading, no doubt, to Best Paper Awards, of course, right? Or help with emerging best practices that we've been working on. So debiasing software and IT pays off in the business, in the classroom, and in diversity and inclusion efforts, in your software and IT, and in society. Here's what a couple of Microsofties said when they used it. It gave me a new way to think, a way to address issues that will benefit everyone, but especially women. And somebody else said it just changed the way I think. So that's it. I'm open for questions. There's a bunch of resources if you want them. Questions? Yeah.
So how does GenderMag account for the intersection of gender with other forms of social identities such as one's sexuality, race, ethnicity? And what do you think might be some risks associated with taking this debugging approach to biases, given that organizations like Microsoft have historically low representation of women, of females, and of other minorities? I think it's 30% right now, just under, barely 4% are African American, even lower for Latino workers at Microsoft. That's just one organization. Mm-hmm. How do you think this debugging approach might actually perpetuate those structural inequities, or do you think there's a workaround?
Okay, so let me divide it into two separate questions. So the first one is dividing the world or thinking of the world as composed of genders is only one way of thinking about it. We can also think about different ethnicities, different education levels, different socioeconomic levels, different ages, all of these different ways. And so GenderMag is an instantiation of a more general method that we call Inclusive Mag. And so we haven't actually published Inclusive Mag yet, but we're in the process of writing a paper right now about it. And so I guess we can think of Inclusive Mag as a meta method. So it shows how to derive methods like GenderMag or ethnicity mag or whatever, it shows how to plow through the literature and the research to find the most central facets, because you have to choose a small subset for the thing to be viable for in practice, and therefore to use that on other ways of dividing up the population. So GenderMag itself, let's say, for example, that we get interested in somebody's socioeconomic status as a way of, that we want to start being more inclusive in our software, because the way people's socioeconomic status also is a strong influence on the way that they reason, especially if they were brought up in a particular socioeconomic classification. So the facet of risk attitude toward technology, and probably computer self-efficacy, those two are probably really pertinent. And so for socioeconomic mag, we might want to keep those two. But then there are other things that really weren't relevant for gender, which might become very relevant for socioeconomic status. So that's why we have to go back to the foundations and pull out the right facets. And so attitude toward authority, for example, is a huge thing in socioeconomic status and the way people reason that maybe isn't quite as pertinent for gender. So Inclusive Mag is the answer to the first part of your question. The second part of the question, which is, that so many of these organizations, well, pretty much all of them, have these huge inequities already in the software profession, and does this make them worse or better? I think it makes them better. And I'll tell you why. First of all, two reasons. First of all, it doesn't require a person of that gender to use GenderMag to find these gender biases or these gender inequities. So that's good. You don't need to have a team that's half women to be able to use it successfully. The second thing is, if you did have a team that was half women, it wouldn't be enough to solve the problem, because in addition to who did the designing, we also have all of this inertia, this trajectory of how software is and what are the design patterns and how do you do stuff. So it would take some real outside-the-box thinking to sort of break through all of that and get back to really creative thought. The third thing is, as long as software has gender biases in it, or whatever kind of biases, socioeconomic or whatever, then what it does is it excludes people early in their life with software. And so, if you have somebody who's trying to problem solve and they're younger, and the first time, they're fine with chat rooms and Facebook and stuff like that, but the first time they're trying to use software for something real, it doesn't really match the way they think. What are they going to do? Say, oh boy, I can't wait to be a computer scientist. No, they're going to say, I'm not good at this. I'll go do something else. And so the software itself is excluding people from the profession who would otherwise be in it. And so if we can fix the biases that in the software, we're opening the doors wider. The other thing is, it gets conversations about diversity and inclusion into the day jobs. So instead of it being like, okay, I took a course, wow, that was really good, now back to my day job. Now, diversity and inclusion bugs are bugs, and you have to fix them. And there has to be conversation about that in the hallways. And so it makes people feel like, yeah, this is a real thing. This is part of what I do. So for me, yeah, I think it's definitely opening the doors to make things better.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. More questions. I promise not to be quite as long-winded on the next ones, but you get me all excited. Yeah.
My My question is, what sort of research methods did you use to determine the cognitive facets?
So yeah, quite a variety of them. We have a diagram that we sometimes use which shows it to be a cycle. And so it started with a lot of literature reading through the sort of foundational sciences, lots from psychology. Feminist literature was another one. And from those, what we were thinking about is we were reading about stuff that has something to do with problem solving, and then we were saying, well, shouldn't this play out in software? And so from that, these hypotheses started landing on the table about how that would come together with the way people use software. And then we took some of these hypotheses into the lab and studied them both quantitatively and qualitatively. And those would then either add some evidence or change our understanding or so on and so forth, send us back to the literature. And so it was around and around like this. So that was how we got started. And then, as I said before, we ended up with way too many facets, so we had to choose just 5. And so our criteria for that were, they had to be grokkable, these facets, by ordinary software developers, even with no background in like psychology or in gender studies or in anything like that. They had to be directly applicable to software usage, and they had to have at least 5 independent empirical studies behind them, done by anybody, it didn't matter whom, because we wanted only really solidly established things in our method. Yeah, and oh, by the way, the personas all have foundation documents that are lying around on our webpage, which is gendermag.org, so you can see the studies for yourself. More questions? Yes?
On the flip side, where do you publish your work?
I've published a lot of it in Chi, which is the human computer, yeah. Let's see, interacting with computers has been friendly to this work. We've had 2 or 3 papers there. Then also software engineering conferences. So Chi is more embracing of this kind of work, but the software engineers are the ones who really need it. So we just published in ICSE last year, the main software engineering conference, and we were happy to be able to do that. And we've submitted another one to one of the software engineering conferences this year. We'll see how we do, and a couple of niche ones. Yeah. Yeah?
So if I'm following, what you're finding is the programmers' biases to think about a population, and they have ideas about that population.
Mm-hmm.
So can this method of debugging also be used for addressing inclusivity with populations where you don't know what your biases are? So where they have a user's need that you have no idea about, for example?
So I don't really have a great answer for that. The sort of classic HCI answer is, go study them and learn stuff about them, and that's, that's certainly way better than nothing. But we have this strong interest in having theoretical foundations, and so if they were following the sort of inclusive mag method, they'd be going back to the literature first and really trying to gather some of the things that psychologists or sociologists or whatever have been finding over the years, and education researchers and stuff, pulling from there and then using that to try to inform the empirical work they did. So that would be what I'd sort of hope they'd do. Yeah. Anybody else? Then I will exit.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.